We are the Law&Crime Network. I'm Linda Kenny Bodden, and we are just going to divert a little bit off Durst while they're in a lunch break in California to the case where we also have going on in California, but it's going to be a retrial, and that is the case of Kellen Winslow II. He is picking a jury as we speak right now in that great state to retry the counts that the jury was hung on the first trial from. As you know, he was charged with 5 victims. 5 victims in that case, and you can see our chart that my co-host, the great Aaron Keller, has made in regard to this, that he was convicted of count 1. He was deadlocked on count 1. They were convicted on count 2 with victim number 2. He was convicted on count 2 with regard to the forcible rape, count 4 with regard to the forcible rape, count 5. They were deadlocked in with regard to Jane Doe number 3. He was guilty of indecent exposure, and you can see, you can go on lawandcrime.com and see all the verdicts. But anyhow, the state has elected to retry him with 5 victims, and they indicated they're going to use all 5 maybe as plan, practice, intent, motive, identity, people, victims, sexual assault, women of Kellen Winslow. But I have with me a very special segment. I have 2 documentarian filmmakers in a film that's going to be released in January 2012. And I'm going to get this right because one of my questions relates to it. It goes, The Girl Who Cannot Speak. And that is... oh my God, they're smiling. Look at, they're smiling at me so much. All right, and that is Laura Pellegrini, yes, who is seated over there, and you can tell her she's in the blue dress, and Stefano DeFrey,
yes,
right?
That's right, totally right.
You
got
it right.
You got it, Linda.
All right, so you made this film about basically the Me Too women.
Yeah.
What did you find about victims, like the victims in Kellen Winslow, for instance? And I would say the documentary is not about that. But victims, can they not speak or won't they speak?
Well, I know that for one of the cases that we had, who was even in her 50s, she was a teacher, a mother, and after the documentary had only told her 3 sons. So she had gone through her entire life not sharing this experience with anybody.
And what had happened to her?
Well, it was a family member, and she was sexually abused when she was 8 years old by an uncle in the family. And through the documentary, you see sort of the stories of how that happened. But there's so much shame, there's so much stigma. I think generationally, there's a huge problem. That's one of the reasons that I think we were very inspired. Laura had also worked at a women's shelter. So she had the experience of many people, and we had gone through probably 40 to 45 cases before we settled on the 5 or 6 that we felt were specific to what we were trying to achieve.
Yeah, and Laura, you know, I was a sexual assault prosecutor. I ran a sex assault crime unit in Monmouth County, New Jersey, when it was not in vogue, before it was a deal. Yeah. And there were certain things that I noticed among victims. What did you notice about why the predator, and I'm going to call them that, whether it be a family member, a priest, somebody off the street, picks out certain victims?
I think that's a great question. I think the trends vary, but I think ultimately what we found was the through line with the stories that we chose was the fact that these women were vulnerable. They were in the throes of their youth. And they were completely helpless in who they could communicate this information to. You know, there's a reason why this crime is underreported and in most cases not reported at all. And women feel that sense of shame in admitting that something happened years later. So that's why these stories are now cropping up. But I would say definitely vulnerability in youth.
Vulnerability and youth.
For sure.
And we saw that in Kellen Winslow also, that there was like a homeless woman.
Of course.
An older homeless woman.
Yeah, a hitchhiker.
And I know you wanted to say something to supplement what Laura was talking about.
Could not believe, because especially in this case, it's so obvious that the people there it's such a power issue. There's a deep sense of power over powerlessness, and that criminality is terrible, terrific.
But talk about criminality, Laura. When you go into a court, as you saw with the Kellen Winslow case, there is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And here, as we know, the reason why we're retrying this case is that the jurors did not believe the prosecution proved beyond a reasonable doubt that some of these assaults happened. Even though I used to close and say, no one comes to be poked and probed in a court of law unless they were forcibly raped.
Right.
What say you?
And I mean, you know, these women who went through this, they had difficulty, pointing out who the prosecutor was. So they would look at a lineup of 6 people, and in one
Which
case,
happened on Winslow,
Exactly, an application to that. So it's not a fair position for a victim to be in, where she's gone through an experience like this, and then is told that it's not right because she came out however many weeks or years later, because it's such a vulnerable small position to be in. How could you be of sound mind to report something like that? And oftentimes that is the case where it's not reported.
Yeah, and Stefano, I found also when I was a prosecutor early on that mothers, sometimes family members, didn't even believe their own child, the person that was reporting them, whether it be a young male, which always was always a problem, especially if they're reporting against an uncle, for instance, or a female. Did you find that the meal ticket is sometimes more powerful than their own blood?
It's horrific that happens. That's a consistency in the documentary, in our documentary, The Girl Who Cannot Speak. You see it all the time, and it's because they don't want to upset the dynamics of the family. And so because there's this sense of like, you know what, let's sweep it under the rug, or it happened over here, let's not address it. Because then if you address it as a family, everyone has to assume the responsibility of how to deal with it as a family. So it becomes, it's a responsibility that not only society you have, but as a family individually, it changes the family dynamics forever.
And here, Laura, one of the things we saw here in the Kellen Winslow case is that some of the women were obviously homeless. Some were, the prosecution would, or the defense would say, well, they were streetwalkers to try to impugn. But there were sexual assault victims also, and I've even found my defendants, especially, I've had two major high-profile defendants who were sexually abused when they were young people, that it carries over. So when you're interviewing with these poor women, did it carry over to their lives, their whole lives, or were some able to compartmentalize it?
I would say especially in the case of one of our victims who, as we said, was molested by an uncle when she was 8 years old. I mean, she's now in her mid-50s, early 60s. So clearly that baggage carried over later on into life. We have focus on a girl who it happened to when she was a teenager, and she's now in her mid-20s. Someone who, again, was molested by, or attempted molestation by a cousin who's now in her mid-30s. So, I mean, you take that baggage with you for life. It's not something that...
And Stefano, you open up your trailer with a woman named Emery who was molested by somebody, Leonard, at the church. And now you can tell us who Leonard was. But did you find it also, it didn't matter social class, race, sex, whether you're male, female, whether you're 5 or 13. Did you find that there was a consistency or an inconsistency among who could be a victim?
I think that's probably the most unsettling thing, that I could not find a consistency in it from whether the person came from a rich background or poor. And you see it in the Winslow case. Look at a guy who had all this available money, come from a place that had plenty of means, and still went ahead and is being tried for this. That is probably the most unsettling thing, that it can happen to anybody, and it does not discriminate between families of classes of rich or poor.
And that's for both the victims and for the abusers, correct?
Correct.
So can we identify, based on even looking at Kellen Winslow, for instance, obviously he's had these problems, according to some reported indications, for a period of time. Are there enablers that cause him to be, let's say, go back out there in the public and commit more crimes, if indeed he's guilty?
I would say so.
I would say certainly if you're more profile and you have more money.
Absolutely, you have more power to lead to these types of situations. What's to stop that type of person, right?
So what you're saying to me is that the powerless people become the victims, and the people with power who want to exert even more power over these poor powerless victims, they're the ones that get taken advantage of.
Absolutely.
So how do we stop it then, Stefano? What did you learn from your documentary that can put some things in place that stop the Kellen Winslows from going out there in the community?
I think also one of the aspects of this is the way that also men interact with each other about talking about sexuality with women. Right. When it's very common for boys to talk among each other, like, how far did you get with a girl? Did you score? Did you get to first base? Did you get to second base? This awareness among young men, this conversation has to be had by both genders, because what happens is, if you empathize the experiences of everybody, you reduce the risk of these things happening, because you create more of a connection. I have found in this case, with the Winslow case as well, it's very hard and even in our documentary, it's very hard to commit these crimes when you recognize that this person is a person, is an actual human being. If you separate yourself from that person as a human being, that begins to start where you can self-justify.
So when you have, let me put it this way, the person who cannot speak, right? You're focusing on 5 women, but you came across, as you said, 45 victims. You went through them all. What made you focus on these 5 victims for your film? And could you give us a comparison to what made Kellen Winslow maybe focus on these 5 victims that he's being tried on, and some of he's already been convicted on?
Well, I think we would certainly go.
Yeah.
We would certainly want. I mean, the homelessness, the woman who was homeless and the hitchhiker, that situation.
And that was a conviction, by the way.
That was a conviction. Yeah.
Right.
So
Right.
It was the number 2 one. Laura could speak on this, as well, working on this, But I really think that youth, specifically for us, was the biggest through line. That this happened. Many of our cases happened when people were very young, between 8, 14, 15, and the girl who's in our documentary who does not speak was underage, and that was very difficult. How to treat that case as filmmakers and documentarians.
Exactly, because she became the core around which the documentary was built. Because these other women do have that platform, and they finally found it in themselves to speak up and out about what happened to them. So that creates a through line with the young girl.
Well, you know what? I cannot wait to see it. Your film, The Girl Who Cannot Speak, comes out in January 2020. It's going to play at the Angelica. You're selected for the St. Louis Film Festival. I mean, it's an incredible topic. I've been doing it and dealing with cases most of my legal life, even though sometimes it's been on the other side for people I believe are not guilty. But The Girl Who Cannot Speak, the Kellen Winslow trial, the jury is back in selection. These are all interrelated and important issues. We thank both of you for being on here today, and I hope that you can come back.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for having us.
And we're going to take a quick break right now, and stay with us, and we'll be back to the Robert Durst case.